Much for joining this session today. I'm Constance Baumler, Vice President for Empowerment Programs and Institutional Relations at the Internet Society. The Internet Society is a global nonprofit organization that promotes the open evolution, development, and use of the Internet for the benefit of all people. I would like to welcome all participants today to the ECOSOC High-Level Political Forum. And today's conversation is going to be about preserving an open internet to achieve SDGs, to achieve the SDGs. And I'd like to give the floor perhaps to Peter Misek, who is co-organizing this session today with us from Access Now. Peter?
Thank you, Constance. Hopefully we can get my video running. I'm definitely glad to be here. Access Now is excited to co-host, and we, first of all, do thank Internet Society for organizing this event. We believe that universal access to ICTs and the open internet are essential drivers of sustainable development. And we do thank the Commission on Science and Technology for Development for welcoming this side event, and I think recognizing the importance of those issues that we're going to discuss today to that mission of reaching the SDGs in a way that's rights respecting. We hope to build bridges between the three pillars of UN mandate on peace and security, development, and human rights, while also focusing on national and local practice and getting down to the nitty-gritty of the data and the concrete measures and policies that advance both sustainable development and human rights in the digital age. So I thank again the organizers and HLPF for providing this platform, and we'll hand it off. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. And today, to moderate the discussion, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Joseph Hull, who's Distinguished Technologist at the Internet Society, where he oversees the strong Internet portfolio, which includes projects on encryption, routing security, and the Internet way of networking. Joe, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Constance and Peter. I'm delighted to be here today. As we've mentioned, this forum is about specifically looking at the role of a free and open internet to achieving Sustainable Development Goals 4 and 5 on quality education and gender equality. As the recent report on the Sustainable Development Goals from the 7th of July points out, the pandemic has had an enormous effect on progress being made towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. This is no more the case than it is when it comes to gender equality and when it comes to quality education. We have a great set of panelists here to discuss this and talk about specifically the way the ICTs have been helping or hindering or facilitating progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm going to introduce each of the panelists one by one. Mr. Zhuang Zhu is currently Director of the Division for Public Institutions and Digital Government, or DESA, where he leads a team in normative, analytical, and capacity building work in promoting inclusive, effective, and accountable institutions that are well equipped to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, including SDG 16. Among the various assignments at the UN Secretariat, Mr. Zhu served as Chief of the Office of Undersecretary General DESA from 2008 to 2013. He was a special advisor to the Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development prior to his reassignment to DESA in 1993. Welcome. Peter Misek, who I know a bit about from previous work, is General Counsel and the Advocacy Manager for the United Nations at Access Now, based in New York City. Access Now is an international organization that defends and extends the digital rights of users at risk. Peter leads the legal team managing risk in a global program and their operations, engaging in various types of strategic litigation, legal support for civic space online. Third is Marielza Oliveira. Dr. Oliveira is the UNESCO Director for Partnerships and Operational Program Monitoring, Communications and Information Sector since February of 2021. From 2015 to 2020, she was director of UNESCO Beijing, covering the 5 East Asian countries. Previously, she was the global results manager, a type of data scientist at UNDP, where she also held positions as country manager for a portfolio of Latin American countries from 2001 to 2015. Welcome. And finally, in no way last and no way least, is Niti Biani from the Internet Society, who is Policy and Advocacy Manager at the Internet Society. She's based in New Delhi. Thank you for joining us so late, Niti. Niti monitors policy developments and advocates for strong encryption and an open internet. She mobilizes, organizes, and builds coalitions to support the Internet Society's advocacy efforts. So we're going to get this started off and dig in a bit, and what I'll do is try to permute the answering. So I'll call on each of you. So first, let's go Zhuang, Marielza, Peter, and then Niti. Can you each talk about how ICTs and the internet have shaped how we approach the Sustainable Development Goals, specifically 4 and 5, but in general? Mr. Zhu.
Thank you. Can you hear me well?
You sound great.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank ISOC and the Open Access for organizing this. And I hope that the following conversations that we're going to have will demonstrate how timely and how important it is. And also importantly, from my perspective, how neglected it has been so far. From our studies that we have undertaken recently, we see that the open internet and digital tools as a whole have made positive contributions towards the SDGs. First of all, in terms of raising awareness, internet is almost today indispensable, and digital technologies have really spurred the campaign on SDGs. So that's a very positive development. And also, if we look at the voluntary national reviews provided by countries, which this week we've seen quite a number of them, around 43, I believe, you see that more and more countries are using the internet and digital technologies as a tool for a better integration and better coordination. So you see the much emphasized linkages among the SDGs have been made more and more prominent thanks to the internet and digital technology. So that's a kind of empowerment tool, implementation tool that has also been positive. And the other thing that I want to emphasize is that internet, when it is open, fair, affordable, in general, has empowered the vulnerable groups. Recently, we've had quite interesting case studies from a number of developing countries, including the positive impact on education and on the health of girls and women, and on the employment opportunities in general for girls and women. When here's the important thing: when they actually have inclusive and fair and equitable access to these technologies. And I will be happy to provide more details as we continue our conversation. And also, hopefully later on, particularly towards the end, we can also talk a little bit about the problems and the challenges they continue to face. Back to you. Thank you.
And I want to go with Marielza first. I think I mispronounced your last name or misspelled it, and so I apologize. That I believe it's
no. You did perfectly well. Thank
Wonderful.
you very much. Well, first of all, hello, Constance, Peter, fellow panelists. I'm really glad to be sharing this very important side event hosted by ISOC and Access Now. Thank you for putting it together. And Jonathan, thank you for the question. Indeed, we all feel the transformative impact of, okay, so I think I can start video now. Oh, okay, great. So I'll start it. Thank you. We do feel the transformative impact of digital technologies. Digital innovation, transformation is really tremendously improving lives. And much of it is actually due to the fact that the internet has expanded opportunities for all of us to enjoy our right to access to information and knowledge. It's a human right. And whether or not we are connected to the internet, we all benefit from being part of a global knowledge society. Just a few examples. Scientific knowledge sharing facilitates faster innovation. Teachers and schools can adapt faster as education resources are expanded and shared openly. Women find opportunities through small businesses, expand their income, expand the quality of life for their families. So for UNESCO, we really work to ensure that we place people's empowerment and well-being at the very center of how digitalization works and evolves. Our vision is to really harness digital technologies for the public good and enable digital transformation to be leveraged for peace, for people, for prosperity, for planet, which are the central pillars of the Sustainable Development Goals. So we cannot achieve the SDGs if we don't ensure that everyone has access to the internet. Nowadays, digital platforms really mediate our access to education, to health, to justice, to most public services. Digital technologies facilitate the effective management of our scarce resources such as water, land, biodiversities, and actually help us to serve people's needs while keeping within planetary boundaries. So the issue is whether the internet is actually not benefiting everyone equally, which hinders some countries and some communities from really progressing towards the SDGs. So this is a big concern for us. Inequality in access to digital knowledge resources. And the two main digital divides that still prevail and prevent people from really enjoying their full access to information and knowledge is the first, lack of human-centered connectivity, meaningful access, which for UNESCO goes well beyond weak internet or lack of affordable devices to also encompass barriers such as the few languages that exist online for people to communicate effectively, web pages and digital spaces that not offer accessibility for persons with disability, and so on. And a second digital divide that comes from the unequal capacities to create socioeconomic value from digital technologies and digital data in a safe way. So that affects everyone, but especially women and girls, developing countries, and particularly those in Africa and communities in rural and remote areas, refugees and other disadvantaged groups. So with these digital divides, the fact that we all benefit collectively if the more people are online sharing knowledge, we all are poorer when people are offline. And therefore, we really want to work towards enabling access, meaningful access to everyone. So back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It takes everything I can to not cheer during both of these first two interventions. Thank you so much. Peter.
Thank you. Yeah, huge +1 to those interventions. I think from Access Now's perspective, the internet did pass the stress test of the last couple of years. The world largely shifted online in March of 2020, major societal systems. That was not a planned event, but the internet responded and it was there. This, threadbare kind of duct tape and chicken wire system that's been set up largely through, what aimed to be horizontal, meritocratic, technical, tech-first governance structures succeeded and it delivered. There are problems though, and that's that not enough people had access in the first place. I think the ITU says 800 million people came online during that first year of the pandemic. That's not enough. And those who did get online, as we've heard, did not experience the same environment. They did not access it through the robust devices that you need really to take advantage of everything that the modern web and certainly the mobile internet offer. And they did not, reach content in the right language that was appropriate, for who they are and who their communities are, that reflected, their identities, their cultures in ways that respect their human rights and their dignity. And, working towards that meaningful access that respects human rights and dignity is I think this what I would call the internet 2.0. That's what we're trying to move towards, is a vision that ensures that we can be our whole selves safely, securely, and openly when we do come online. And that takes investment. And what we want to do, I think today is focus a bit more on those interlinkages between human rights and what seem more like technical or maybe commercial drivers behind sustainable development, and show that they're actually quite interwoven. With Access Now, we study intentional disruptions to connectivity, to places where we're obstructed and interfered with in our exercise of human rights in the digital age. And we have focused for the last few years on this growing problem of intentional disruptions through internet shutdowns. This is a form of censorship. It's also a form of disruption. Not all disruptions are intentional. They come from natural disasters, as we saw. I think the volcanic eruption, right, in the Pacific, really disrupted an island, and the world rallied around, bringing those folks in the South Pacific back online. And that's what we try to bring is that sort of attention, because if you've lost internet access due to a natural disaster or due to a human intervention through an internet shutdown, the impacts are devastating in both those scenarios, and they're particularly devastating on these sustainable development goals that we're going to discuss today. SDG 4 emphasizes technical education. When the world shifted online, I think it emphasized how much we depend on modern technologies to deliver access to knowledge, to participate in the knowledge society, in the information society. We do need, a robust, open, affordable, and secure connection to the internet. And certainly for that technical education, which I think a number of sub-targets of the 4th Sustainable Development Goal hit on. And then Goal 5 is actually more explicit with a sub-target to promote empowerment of women through technology. People of diverse genders seek technology in order to help, right the inequities that they face on a daily basis. They are first adopters in many cases. Marginalized and vulnerable communities and communities at risk do depend on access to ICTs, I would say more so and earlier than a lot of other groups in society, because they've been forced to those margins and forced to adopt and adapt. And women especially, face patriarchal, very traditional environments in the built environment, in the physical world. There's all types of surveillance and patriarchal structures that prevent them from having their access to their own devices, and being able to access information and knowledge from the safety and security of your own home is really key for women in particular in a lot of societies. And these are the kinds of impacts that internet shutdowns kind of compound, these adverse impacts. And that's what we actually ask, and we're going to continue asking, is help kind of studying those impacts and understanding how these particular rights, like the right to education, the right to access the benefits of science and technology, and of course, the right to gender equity and equality are both impacted by disruptions, but also could be kind of strengthened through a more robust attention, not just from the human rights crowd, but from the sustainable development actors.
Thank you, Peter. Neethi.
Thanks, Joe. I think it's always tricky to follow such a stellar panel, but I'm going to still try and add my 2 cents. So we've heard so much about, what the internet means, and, especially in the time of the global pandemic that we all collectively went through. We definitely now know that the ICTs and the internet, especially, are the 2 sort of pillars upon which the SDGs success is predicated. And the internet is a critical enabler of the SDGs. It is not only a vital communication tool, but it is also a powerful catalyst for innovation, social and economic development. And it is the foundation of our global digital economy. So when you consider the role that the internet plays in the provision of services and applications, whether you're shopping or banking, whether you're trying to learn online, accessing healthcare, just working, the opportunities that it unlocks for women, girls, the marginalized and underrepresented groups, it is indisputable that the internet then becomes critical to achieving so many SDGs. I think I should also take the opportunity to note here that the ICTs and the internet as an infrastructure are not mentioned as a separate goal in the SDGs. But and even though they are mentioned about 4 or 5 times in specific targets and indicators, all 17 SDGs, when combined with innovative policies, services, and solutions, can be a powerful means of implementation in many, many significant ways. So whether we're looking at accelerating and upscaling services in health, education, financial services, agriculture, low carbon energy systems, or whether we're looking at accelerating institutional learning through online communities, economizing resources and reducing the costs of service delivery through upgrading their quality, reducing deployment costs, and driving progress in many, many more sectors, improving existing technologies with innovation, connectivity, productivity, and efficiency. Last but not the least, enhancing public awareness and engagement with the internet and so many of these various facets that impact our lives. So among the 17 SDGs, especially SDG 4, which is focused on quality education, and SDG 5, which focuses on gender equality, ICTs and the internet then become critical towards attainment of some of the targets, particularly in the areas of information and delivery of services. We've often seen that there is no replacement for governments, especially in low-income countries and developing countries, for delivery of service, because a bigger and bigger proportion of the population depends on public service delivery. And therefore, the internet also helps shape outcomes that contribute towards achievement of other SDG targets. So when we see the sort of progress that's been made towards connectivity, in 2015, there were about 3 billion people connected to the internet, which was about 41% roughly of the world population. And in 2021, according to ITU estimates, 4.9 billion people, that's roughly 63% of the world population, is now using the internet. But our work isn't nearly done. The conversation on the connectivity divide that some of my panelists have talked about so eloquently, the conversation on this divide has evolved over time to be included in so many different international fora, such as the United Nations. We're having this conversation on this very platform. And now it's one of the central themes of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So, we have so many different pathways. For example, the Secretary General's roadmap on digital cooperation, it serves as a blueprint for implementing, the Secretary General's high-level panel on digital cooperation. And it has the ability and the potential to recommend and implement these recommendations on global connectivity and outline some of these steps that we must take to ensure that people have safe and affordable internet access by 2030. And this access, as my fellow panelists already mentioned, must be meaningful and in line with sustainable development goals. Back to you, Joe.
Okay, now we've just gotten started. This is amazing. So to give everyone an idea of what we're going to do, we have 2 more sets of questions for the panelists. They'll each spend 3 minutes talking about examples of efforts that are actually contributing, and then challenges to both of the sustainable development goals we're discussing. We'll then have a little bit of a break in the sense that we'll take questions from the audience. And so please, in the Zoom interface, there's a Q&A button. Please submit questions in there that we can use for Q&A and have panelists expand further in places that you're interested in. We'll have one more question for all the panelists that I'll ask, and then we'll go back into Q&A, and then I'll conclude. So be thinking of good questions and put them in the Q&A functionality in Zoom, and we'll go, we're going to rotate participants again. I'll go Peter, Nithi, Yuang, Marielza. So the question for this round is, what are some of the efforts to expand internet connectivity? So examples that you might know of or think of or that have seen that have been particularly impactful or clever, and how do those efforts contribute to the achievement of SDGs 4 and 5? Peter.
Sure. Thank you. So again, I come from the human rights world, and we have been advancing. We weren't the first adopters, but for about 10 years, we've been advancing norms that say human rights apply online as offline, that all those rights and interests and privileges that we enjoy and that we've spent the last 6-7 decades elaborating through our human rights framework, all of that work is not thrown out the window because we have this new separate cyberspace that really we need to find ways to ensure we can exercise robustly those rights in these new digital spaces and through these new and emerging technologies. And so I am excited about efforts that we've undertaken in civil society. We advance conversations on this through my organization's convening RightsCon. We just held last month. And again, being forced online, I think, ensured that a whole lot more people and a whole lot more countries could engage in these sorts of conversations about, what the future of human rights in the digital age means, and what is meaningful connectivity. And we are up to almost 10,000 folks were able to participate in that event, and so that's for our part that and our Keep It On campaign that again speaks directly to this issue of internet shutdowns. But the campaign is #KeepItOn. We are a positive framing, and we really want to work with more stakeholders to end internet shutdowns, but really to do so in a way that advances, the norm that I think is emerging, that internet access, that robust universal access to this global resource is actually necessary to achieving global respect for human rights and I would argue sustainable development and probably peace and security. And it's this message that I think originates out of the human rights community, but we need more partners to really achieve. And what we're doing through this campaign is building. We're around 300 civil society partners. Again, looking at the particular ways that communities at risk, and that's often feminist groups, women and girls trying to access reproductive health information, for example. LGBTQI groups and those exploring issues around sexual orientation and gender identity, also turning to non-traditional, non-broadcast or traditional sources of information in order to really build their identities, find community, and express themselves. And those are the folks that we are looking to show us the way that this internet should be continually built, to show us why it's so important to be able to depend on your internet access, because that's something that happens when you suffer a disruption. Is if it happens enough time, the first time is shocking. If it happens enough, you'll sort of build a life that is a bit turned off from that. When you can't rely that you will have open, dependable, safe access to the internet, and that's not the information society I think that we're trying to build. So that's why we do advance this notion, and I would point people towards the latest report to the Human Rights Council by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I know it gets in the weeds, but there's such great exploration there of how internet shutdowns also impact the economic, social, and cultural rights, and a really clear expression by the office that development aid actors have not paid sufficient attention to the risks and impact of shutdowns when they're designing agreements to fund, the development of ICT infrastructure. They're giving money to governments to, ensure that they're reaching that goal 9, that target 9C to connect everyone, but they're not, putting into those grant agreements some safeguards to ensure that somebody doesn't just flick the kill switch when it's convenient, and that's the the kind of more holistic approach towards connectivity we're trying to promote. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. Niti.
Thanks. I think Peter talked about sort of like the qualitative and rights-based aspect of increasing connectivity. I'm going to take a moment to talk about what it means to actually bring more access and connectivity to the people who are underconnected at the moment. So there are nearly about 3 billion people right now who are not connected. And this is especially for the case for people who are living in remote rural and urban areas, as well as underserved areas. And then there are still hundreds of more people that don't have reliable or affordable internet services. And it is this digital divide that is so critical to achieving the SDGs, and these require innovative approaches. Despite the fact that we did see a booming of people getting connected and people buying more and more hardware to get connected to the internet during the pandemic, our research has shown that internet growth is slowing down. But there are solutions. And I'd like to take one moment to talk about one of the key things that the Internet Society focuses on, and that's building community networks. So these are networks built by and for the communities that they serve. And these are complementary access solutions, right? So they shouldn't be considered something that's permanent and done and dusted, and then therefore we don't need to pay attention to those communities at all. These are complementary access solutions, and they rely on local champions and partners. So what does a community network even do or look like? So every community network has a different size. It serves anywhere between 50 to 50,000 users. It has a different setup, ranging from servicing voice and SMS only or Wi-Fi only, and is either a mesh network or a municipal network. Community networks can serve different purposes. So whether it's gaining access or improving affordability, greater openness or more autonomy, community networks can offer an underserved community, all of those things. And finally, a community network is governed in different ways depending on where that network is. So you can be governed by a nonprofit member association or a small business, or a community network can partner with governments, NGOs, the internet technical community, or network operators. And we have so many success stories to share about communities driving change to benefit from what the internet has to offer, ranging from Brazil, South Africa, Pakistan, Zimbabwe, India, you name it. The list is endless, and I'm happy to share more details about these stories if people are interested, in the chat or after this panel. But the few things I think we might want to keep in mind about the pillars of what these community networks look like. So there is a policy and regulatory framework to think about. Favorable policy environments will enable network building. It makes it simple and run seamlessly. There is the backhaul to think about. So if we can get access to fiber or a favorable internet service provider, it becomes easier to provide capacity to run that community network on. There's knowledge and technical know-how. So if we have the technical capabilities required to maintain and expand that network, it just makes it easier for that particular community to run that network. Then, of course, there's users, critical mass of users that gain benefits from the internet and the access that it provides to be able to foster that network. And then finally, sustainability, where the ability to keep the network running financially without having to depend on external agencies for support is a great way to keep that network running and even expand it. Most recently, and I'll conclude with this, the ITU and the UN Tech Envoy's Office launched the Partner to Connect Digital Coalition, which is a multi-stakeholder alliance aimed at fostering meaningful connectivity and digital transformation. So the Internet Society joined this coalition, where we've pledged to deploy 100 complementary access solutions in remote and rural areas and train 10,000 people to manage and maintain these local network infrastructures. Because when we have these solutions at our disposal, there's absolutely no limit to what we can service. Back to you, Joe.
Wonderful. Juwon, please.
Thank you. I think both Peter and Nili have made great interventions by identifying the problems we face and the consequences there are, and Nili really gave very comprehensive sort of answers on some of the concrete measures, and I feel that we do sort of see a convergence of views even now after half an hour conversation about the the issues, the challenges we face, and some of the concrete solutions. Perhaps I want to add a couple of points. Number one, on the SDGs, when the SDGs were negotiated starting from 2012, almost over a period of 3 years to 2015, the internet and the digital tools, people already realize their importance. But I would say the awareness of their empowering tool and their indispensable to our society, the way how internet and digital technology are indispensable to our society, is not, at that time, was not as strong as it is today. I think one of the things that emerged from the pandemic is the heightened awareness of how indispensable the internet it is to our society today. And that is why, Peter's emphasis on keeping the internet open access and fair to safe to everyone. But there is some effort underway right now. The Secretary General Nili mentioned earlier that the Tech Envoy is working with ITU to sort of make some progress in building access at the community level. The Secretary General has through his our common agenda, has really put a spotlight on the challenges and opportunities we face now from the availability of digital technologies and the internet access. And one of the unique initiatives in our common agenda that the SDG has launched is this Global Digital Compact. The Tech Envoy is working with the entire UN system, including with ITU and UNESCO and the other parts of the system, in trying to identify some of the common principles that can support the visions of the Global Compact. And one of the things, keep the internet safe, open, and accessible is part of the ongoing conversation under the negotiations of the common agenda. And the other thing is, and also the issue of the trust. So what we see now is an enhanced awareness of all of this. But I have to also mention, if back in 2015, there was no such a prominent emphasis on digital technology, and we have seen some awareness now, but the transition is still not at the level we want. The transition is still not at the level that is commensurated to the empowering tool and to the potential of open access of internet and digital technologies. I cited the example of one of the study we did recently. Our team went through 172 voluntary national reports. And what we saw was that the emphasis of political leadership, the emphasis of providing financing for SDGs, and the emphasis of changing mindset, they were there. It was mostly in almost 70-80% of the voluntary national reports. But when you look, and the internet there's enough reference to the internet. For example, I think about 60% of the voluntary national reports refers to the internet as a tool. But if you consider some of the more sort of detailed applications of internet and digital technologies to the specific SDGs, the reporting rate goes down to about 20%. So we see this situation where there's an enhanced awareness of the importance of internet, including how important, how critical it is to keep it open, keep it accessible to the stakeholders, and applying individually to the specific SDGs, including SDG 4 and SDG 5. And Nili mentioned a lot of best practice, and so do we. We also have databases on best practice. That said, among the level of government, among the different level of ministries of government, this awareness is still not as prominent as it should be, at the same level as financing and for example leadership. And that is something all of us, we should work together to change and to continue enhance the dialogue, the conversation, or the actions to enhance access to the internet. I'll stop here. Back to you, Joe.
Thank you so much. Love hearing about what's happening and how you're doing the analysis. Marielza.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me speak about some of the efforts that UNESCO is doing with partners. We work on a lot of fronts to eliminate the digital divides that I had mentioned to you. For instance, we are co-founders of the United Nations Broadband Commission for Sustainable Development. And so we advocate together with the ITU for inclusive infrastructure development, contribute to research on new business models that can promote meaningful connectivity and close existing gaps, rural, urban, gender, other gaps. And in addition, we work towards the green digital transformation, promoting models of connectivity that actually can take into account the environmental aspects of it, harness the power also of digital technologies for greening economic transitions. So that's one element. A big part of what we do, in support to member states is to generate robust evidence for people-centered digital innovation and transformation. And here, I have to recognize and appreciate the support that we receive from the Internet Society on UNESCO's Internet Universality Rome Principles, which have been endorsed in 2015 by UNESCO's member states. And these 4 principles, the Rome principles: human rights, R for human rights, O for openness, A for accessibility, M for multi-stakeholder participation, and the associate indicators enable countries to take a national assessment that then lead to national level recommendations and policies for human-centered internet development. And we currently have 45 countries using this framework to improve the internet. And that applies, from A to Z. We have from Argentina to Zimbabwe, and developing and developed countries find opportunity to improve the internet in there. We also work with the IGF colleagues to move the conversation from just connectivity, which is infrastructure,
Recording stopped.
To meaningful connectivity, which
Recording
is
in
infrastructure,
progress.
plus devices, plus affordability, to also encompass the responsibilities of the platforms themselves, meaningful access. The platforms are responsible for providing an enabling environment for information and knowledge exchange. So accessibility, multilingualism, etc. So those are not things that users can do or governments can do. Those are the platform responsibilities. And we also promote access to information through legal guarantees for the right to information and how they apply in digital spaces. For example, one aspect of our work on cyberspace accessibility, including on technology-enabled access for persons with disabilities and aging citizens, so that we can refine policy for that, for digital inclusion. Another priority that we have is to build digital skills and competencies so that people can fully participate in digital ecosystems. We do normative instruments, competency frameworks, capacity building networks, and so to equip different types of actors in how they can do digital transformation at scale. And just an example of that, we just hosted the preparatory meeting for the Transforming Education Summit that will happen in New York in the UN General Assembly in September. And with the experience of 1.6 billion learners that were kicked out of school all of a sudden, behind them, the 150 ministers of education that came in person to this preparatory meeting were unanimous in saying one thing: we must scale up efforts towards digital transformation in education systems. We must equip teachers to play their role in fostering digital skills of learners of all ages in formal, informal, and non-formal education systems, so that we can really have a digitalized, responsible digitalized society. And for that, we'll work in several fronts. For once, we have a 2019 recommendation on open education resources to foster the development and deployment of open education resources that support the development of skills for accessing, creating, sharing knowledge in an open environment. We have an ICT competency framework for teachers to facilitate the realization of digital transformation national objectives by systematically building skills of teachers themselves so that they can impart these skills to their learners, because there's a huge gap. Young people are on the internet and they learn from older teachers who themselves are not internet savvy. So this is one of the things that we need to correct in sync. But we also build skills of young learners, raising awareness of new technologies, foster their interest in contributing to their development, build their access, their capacities to actually develop digital ecosystems as well as to safely navigate them, because actually safety is a real huge issue as well. We do recognize that the expansion of the internet ecosystems and platforms has also brought risks. And we see erosion of freedom of expression, right to privacy, biased algorithm-driven decision models that sometimes exclude or penalize vulnerable groups, cybersecurity risks, data breaches, cyberbullying, hate speech, disinformation, and so on. So to connect everyone, we need also to connect them responsibly. And a central element for that is to foster media and information literacy in the internet users, so that people can really have a safe and meaningful online presence. This includes, for example, developing of training platforms for teachers, for young people to collaborate and develop projects on media and information literacy, raise their awareness about the types of skills necessary that they can benefit from information, and recognize and fight mis and disinformation, for example. And the final thing that I wanted to mention is our Youth Mobile initiative that combines skills, digital skills learning with entrepreneurship capacity development, and introduces young people to coding skills as a resource to solve local issues so that they can contribute to SDGs, for example, as a tool to develop complex learning, skills, but also as a means for them to improve their own income. And so 9 million young people in Africa alone in the last 4 years passed through these types of programs and launched apps and different types of games and systems and etc. that they've themselves generated. So that improves their income, that improves awareness of and capacities in the country, and so on and so forth. So let me stop here. Otherwise, I'll just go on and on because there's so many things to share. So,
thank you so much. So wonderful. Going from efforts that contribute to SDGs, we now want to talk about challenges. And let me take a moment and encourage the audience to think of hard or fun or creative questions for our panelists. I have a few, but they're not going to be nearly as interesting as the ones you can think up yourselves. So we're going to, in this time, go right back to Maria-Elsa. So take a sip of water, deep breath. We're going to go right back to you, and then to Peter, then Nithi, and then Zhuang. And so we want to think about the challenges. What kinds of challenges specifically are undermining the achievement of SDGs 4 and 5 related to ICTs? Are there ones that may not be directly related to ICTs, but that ICTs also resonate with? I'm just wondering, how do you see challenges undermining the achievement of these particular sustainable development goals?
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's a difficult question because there are many things that I would like to point out. But let me mention one thing that was mentioned earlier by one of our panelists, that over the last 2 years, really we had 782 million people join the internet, since the onset of the pandemic. That's 20% of our internet users, and that's an extraordinary thing, and it's a fantastic gain. But on the other, and so the internet proved itself to be resilient, and it contributed to our own resilience. The internet became a lifeline. We continued working, we continued learning, we continue to access public services, consuming, being in touch with communities, and so on, because we had this new additional resilience mechanism. But we should keep in mind that actually the people who joined in the last 2 years, they joined in tremendously precarious ways. They didn't join before because they didn't want to or didn't see value on the internet. Essentially, they didn't join before because they could not afford it. They didn't have the means to do it. And then they are hanging on by a thread, literally, because from the demand side, they could not join. Connectivity was weak in their areas of residence. They could not buy the devices or the data packages to actually, enjoy the stream content of interest and so on. But also because the internet was not offering them the same advantages that it offers us, middle and class people. For example, this on the multilingualism issue that I was mentioning, 7,061 languages active in the world. The internet only offers languages, 300 actively can be used on the internet. That means that speakers from 6,750 languages are not able to have an email with their name, to name their little small business, online business, with the name that they have offline. There's no Unicode for their languages. So content on the internet is extremely limited for them. Users with audio or visual impairment cannot access content. It's not easy for them to exchange with others. So for the internet to really work best for everyone, we are actually doing something different. We are raising capacities of those that make policy and program decisions about the internet. So we are targeting specifically supporting digital transformation for civil servants in ministries of ICT, with a competency framework on digital transformation and artificial intelligence for civil servants, so that we can identify the skills, the knowledge that they require to foster digital transformation at scale to resolve some of these issues that exist. We are training 4,400 judicial operators in 140 countries on artificial intelligence and the rule of law. These people are regulating digital processes and new technologies without the knowledge of how these technologies work and what are the gaps that exist. So capacity building for them, actually trickles down and enables capacity building for the entire society. And it fosters human rights, legal-based, process that really enables our digital ecosystems to work best for everyone. So that's where, I think that some of the gaps exist in the civil services themselves, and that's where we are, really targeting our central elements of our support. Thank you.
We are not wanting for challenges, are we, in the ICT space? Peter.
Yeah, no, and unfortunately we're not. I think I, have put on the table a few times this issue that Access Now is focused on, of internet shutdowns. I can say a little bit more about that, and then talk about some of the other threats that we focus on. So yeah, our Keep It On coalition does track this issue of intentional disruptions, and this is a form of censorship that really goes after person-to-person communications platforms like messaging apps or social media websites, and sometimes entire telecom networks. We documented 182 shutdown incidents last year in 2021. That's up from 159 in 2020. But almost more worryingly, we saw 5 more countries shut down the internet in 2021 than the previous year. And that's really worrying, because once a country hits that kill switch one time, it can become an ingrained practice. And this, combined with some other trends that we've seen, the increase in the length, the scale, and the sophistication of shutdowns, they're lasting longer in places like the Tigray region of Ethiopia or Myanmar's Rakhine state, and they're more targeted as well, targeting specific popular communications platforms or specific populations, even like folks in refugee camps or displaced populations on the move. The sophistication and the growth in the number of states really puts this problem front and center. And I'm very glad, as we've heard, our common agenda has broad support across the UN, and that does name internet shutdowns as one of the key, I think, threats to the Secretary General's vision of a world characterized by digital cooperation and achievement of the SDGs. And in addition, these shutdowns do have particular impacts on students. People not only can't learn or access online classes, sometimes they can't even take the tests or submit the applications they need to get into the schools or get those student loan and grants secured. For women and non-binary folks and folks of other genders, the internet cuts off crucial access to health information when it's not available. These shutdowns, we need more information on how these shutdowns impact women and girls. But one area we're looking is on economies. And, we have a sense that women might depend more on informal economies, on, mobile financing, mobile networks through which they, sell their goods and services, marketplaces on WhatsApp groups. And, when these are shut down and then they still don't have access to those more traditional marketplaces, it can have a particularly adverse effect on, these are the very folks that, these goals are trying to get integrated into the global economy, integrated through financial inclusion. When you lack access to those digital tools, it really has a particular impact. I will also want to add a bit on security and digital security. That is also a big focus for our organization. Access Now runs a 24/7 digital security helpline, and that's just one of a number of growing civil society offerings that try to help folks, understand how to protect their digital safety, understand their threat models when they come online. Unfortunately, women journalists, face particular risks, for example, of harassment, doxing, surveillance, and disinformation. And we try to equip civil society with these tools. And I think this is part of that larger digital literacy effort. But digital security research and digital security information itself can be criminalized. It can be caught up in these, well-meaning cyber crime and cyber security legal reform measures. And it's a place that I think we need to look out for, is this kind of securitization and militarization. Thanks.
Wonderful, wonderful. I believe Niti's next.
Thanks. I think Marielza and Peter have spoken about sort of like different accessibility and connectivity issues that we face in trying to achieve the SDGs, and in particular SDGs 4 and 5. In my mind, potentially one of the greatest threats that we're also facing is coming from a potential fragmentation or the splintering of the internet, which popularly we've come to know as the splinternet. So the internet needs a bunch of fundamental properties to make sure that it exists and thrives. And these offer us benefits that we've all come to know and rely upon. But what happens when, any of these properties or enabling factors of the internet are manipulated or are messed with? The splinternet becomes the opposite of the internet. Very simply speaking, the splinternet is the idea that the open, globally connected internet that we all use splinters or even fragments into a collection of isolated networks that are controlled by governments and businesses. So very simply speaking, if I have to unpack this, what it means is that the internet's simplicity that makes our experiences so seamless online begin to look quite different. So we don't currently have to negotiate with a gatekeeper to send an email or access healthcare or even send our business contracts to our clients, right? But if we are one of those people who are lucky to have fast, affordable, and reliable internet access, we can simply just go online and do these things. But what the splinternet means is that these very basic things that we take for granted become way more complicated. So maybe our friends never receive that email. Maybe we have to pay to access certain websites. And maybe we have to use different invoicing platforms to get those invoices out. And the reason that this worries me is because the splinternet is closer than ever. The way that the internet society sees the splintering of the internet take place is happening mainly through 3 different avenues. The first is internet shutdowns, which Peter's already spoken to great length about, and I'm not going to get into it. Internet shutdowns are extremely, extremely bad for those who are impacted by them. The second would be politicized decisions about internet access and infrastructure. So mainly people deciding who should have access and who shouldn't. And usually these calls come now and then, especially in high conflict situations where a group of actors are calling for a whole country to be disconnected. But these calls for disconnecting a certain population or a certain group of people, are increasingly making politically motivated decisions that could disconnect networks in other countries from the internet's infrastructure. So what would that mean for people, in those countries or those regions, to not be able to access every single service or benefit that the internet has to offer? So any one of these actions, if it's truly implemented, could set a very dangerous precedent. And it could spark similar actions worldwide. And we're seeing this in more than one country at the moment. Either countries are trying to do this themselves, or they're calling for other countries to be disconnected. And then finally, there are policies and business decisions that don't protect the internet. So any action or any decision that could disrupt networks from being a part of the global internet is harmful for the internet's health. And it's harmful for what it might do for SDGs 4 and 5 and the SDGs in totality. So while a single decision may not completely disrupt the internet, because we've seen that it's one of the most resilient resources we have, but how every river meets the sea, every single one of these regulations and policies or business decisions which fail to protect the internet and fail to protect what it needs to exist and thrive will contribute to the growth of the splinternet. And if we do not have a reliable internet, we jeopardize attempts to increase access to those who don't have it and impact what those who do have access to the internet can do online. I'm going to stop there, I think.
Thank you. And Mr. Yuang, about challenges, what's your perspective there?
I think I will probably repeat what Peter, Marielza, and
you will resonate.
Yes, probably maybe the following points. First of all, I mean, from the UN perspective, there is still this need for investment in connectivity, and it's there. Interestingly, this morning, we in our directors' meeting, my fellow director who produced the statistics report on the SDG gave a very grim picture. Essentially, almost all the indicators on the SDGs are negative. But he did mention, he said there's one positive news, and that is, the 700 million more people have now access to the internet, as Nietzsche mentioned quite eloquently early on, and that was a positive news. And so if you consider that to be the only positive news in today's world, I think it is something to be welcomed. But left unsaid is that what about this remaining 30-40% of people who still do not have access? The World Bank has done a very interesting study and shared the results with us. And they did some study in countries, in regions with better access to the internet and those regions without access to the internet. So it's surprisingly, the contrast is surprisingly stark. The areas with sort of good access to internet has 4 times faster GDP growth. And the areas with good internet access has 10 times more opportunities for employment. And if you apply this extensively to Africa and to some other low connectivity regions in the developing world. So I would say physical connectivity, good, broadband access remains a main challenge for a lot of countries in the world. And the second point I probably want to say in terms of challenge is what Marielza mentioned earlier, meaningful access. And the meaningful access is so broad, so vast in terms of challenges that the Internet Governance Forum actually set up a policy network on meaningful access. It covers everything that Peter mentioned about, internet shutdown, because you don't really have meaningful access if the internet's shut down, and you don't have meaningful access if you don't have your own language versions to learn and to access information, and you don't meaningful access if you are a girl and you're a woman, you are denied the opportunity to use access to have access to the internet, while the boys, men dominate the access. So all of this combined do represent a serious challenge in a lot of developing countries. And finally, there's the issue of pricing. The pricing for internet in many countries remains exorbitant. it's prohibitive. It's particularly when you approach it as a percentage of your monthly income. It's just even if you have the physical connectivity, meaningfully you actually cannot afford it. So that's another challenge. And finally, I would really say that the safety, the security aspect, and by safety I mean all of the online problems we are facing now, in terms of misdisinformation, in terms of hate speech, in terms of politicized internet for illegal and unlawful gains, and the cyber crimes. These are the safety part, and I see also increasingly the trend of militarizing cyberspace, and that's something really that we should pay attention to now before it's getting too late. I'll stop here. Back to you.
That was a profound ending as I think about things like NotPetya that just tore through entire hospitals and educational institutions as a tool of software warfare. Thank you all so much. Okay, so we have a question that I've asked the panelists to think about in the chat. So look at that so you get a chance to think about that before I ask it. But we'll first ask a question from an anonymous attendee who says, Niti and Peter mentioned shutdowns as a negative thing. But wouldn't it make exams more robust with less cheating if the internet was limited just during the time of exams? Wouldn't this help SDG4? And the way I interpret this is SDG4 is about education. If you're trying to do things that are fundamentally about making education more robust, more authentic, etc., what's the case to be made against shutdowns during exams, and does it help or hurt, in your opinion, SDG4 on education? And I'll open it up to anyone who wants to start first.
Thank you. Well, I have to say I do look to UNESCO in all matters regarding education. So they're definitely the experts. But I can say that, thank you for writing that, because we actually have seen for years now, a lot of governments shutting down the internet nationally annually during the final exams, during the school exams, and that happens across a number of countries: Sudan, Syria, I think Algeria, Iraq. And they're on regular schedules. At this point, they're even published. We're going to shut down the internet for 3 mornings in a row across the country in order to stop cheating and to create a more equitable exam environment. Certainly and that's a great example of a good intention. Certainly, we don't want to see cheating rampant on these really important national exams. But we come in and say, let's look at the risks and the benefits here, and let's first acknowledge that you are interfering with fundamental human rights. And if you are going to interfere with our rights, not only for free expression and assembly and association, but also economic and social and cultural rights that as we've heard the internet delivers, those interferences need to be necessary and proportionate to the threat. And we really beseech UNESCO and education ministries to find less invasive and less adverse ways of combating that problem of exam cheating, and that's, I think, another great area for research.
Marielza, please.
I'll have to jump in, to that, because I have to echo what Peter has said. This is not in any way something that UNESCO would condone or recommend. And I'm pretty sure that the person who asked the question will actually understand that, when you shut down the internet, you don't shut down the internet for a student. You shut down the internet, like for everyone, in a particular community, in a particular home even, and that means that anybody in there is actually deprived of the right to access information at that moment. And so that they cannot use they cannot receive email from anybody. Imagine that you're at work and you need to receive email, to exchange information. You cannot do that. And you imagine that you're actually in a hospital, and you actually need to access, the internet to receive, the results of your exam. You cannot, a doctor cannot do that. So the internet is shut down. It deprives everyone that has been part of that shutdown of the ability to enjoy their right. It's a human right to access to information, to freedom of expression. The person cannot send information either. So we are indeed, like Peter said, dealing with fundamental human rights, and that is obviously not something that helps, the SDG. You cannot, progress towards, a sustainable development goal by sacrificing the human rights of that person involved or anyone else. So obviously that is, that's not preventing cheating in any ways. Also, you could have the material, printed out beforehand and have it, so there is just simply no way that helps in any way with the process. So what we recommend is actually that, the systems of testing, become a bit more sophisticated, and instead of having to rely on consulting materials and etc. online, on memorization of information and etc., that they actually go into critical thinking kinds of questions, so that it's irrespective of whether you have or not access to, to the internet at that particular moment, that challenges your knowledge and your thinking rather than challenging your memory and your ability to search. And so if that's, that's the kind of thing that actually resolves this problem. Shutting down the internet is never helping, SDG 4 or any other SDG, that I can think of. So thank you. And but it's a very good question that lets us to explain that process, and from our perspective. Thank you.
Super lucid. Nithi or Yuang, if you'd like to respond to this one, you're welcome to. You don't have to.
I will probably say that I fully agree with Peter and Maria. It's, cheating is bad, but there are better ways of dealing with cheating than shut down the internet. Over to you.
Okay. So I put a question. Hopefully panelists have a chance to look at it. I didn't want to just, thrust it upon you, but I'd like to think specifically about SDG 5, gender equity and equality. It's really easy for me as someone, I work in security and privacy. And so, it's really easy for me to see how the internet and ICTs can help education and help people sort of grow. I mean, I've spent my whole life as an astronomer and before using that kind of stuff. It's harder for me to make the direct connection of ICTs and the internet for gender, the gender digital divide, some people call it, in so many senses, not just man, woman, but non-binary and other kinds of identity expressions and dynamic identities. Just wondering if anyone could highlight for us the specific challenges and maybe even opportunities in the space of making gender sort of a less distinguishing feature of how people experience online interactions and, are able to sort of be more authentic in their offline selves, I would think. I don't know who to send this to, but feel free if anyone has thoughts.
I'll just jump in, to warm up this space, I suppose. We see digital divides, gender digital divides in all aspects of the internet, from the access to connectivity itself, and devices. Imagine that you have a poorer household, and you have one phone, and that one phone is the means by which you access the internet. Who do you think is going to be asked to give it up if a breadwinner has to use the phone for work? It's usually, the women of the household that suffer that. Women are offline in greater proportions than men. They are not connected in greater proportions. They are not accessing the internet in the same proportions. They have the cheapest data packages if they have a data package, and they usually transfer that to kids if they need to download homework and things like that. And of course, they are also, on the other extreme, they are less safe online. Just one example, one strikingly sad example from the work that UNESCO does. 73% of all journalists, women journalists online, are harassed and threatened online. And 20% of those suffer physical real life attacks because they are doxxed, and people receive their the information of where they live. They receive threats of rape. Maria Ressa, who recently won the Nobel Prize, Peace Prize, who is a journalist, in the space of 2 months, she received 400,000 threats and online. This is an astounding thing, a barrage of threats. And of course, LGBTI, folks are also, harassed online to a great extent. So this kind of issue is astounding. The equivalency for men, it's like 10%. For women, 73% of women journalists. 3 out of 4 women that work online as a journalist, as a blogger, as a vlogger, as a journalist, whatever, they are threatened. This is an astounding thing. So this digital divide goes from women or girls that are not incentivized for STEM education, so that they can become coders and developers, and create these technologies later on, all the way, to how when they are online and performing their work, they actually, are also being abused and harassed. So it's a tremendous thing. So we need to really think about how we create safe, welcoming, equal, digital spaces for all genders. I posted on the link, now, and I'm posting it for everyone. Sorry, I posted it just for hosts and panelists. But one work that we did for on how the artificial intelligence works affects the working lives of women. Digital algorithms, for example, they look at past data in order to predict what a good candidate is from on human resources. Well, past data was data in which CVs of men, because of a past, kind of tradition of hiring men, become the future as well. The women get less opportunity for jobs simply because the artificial intelligence algorithms are actually looking at what a successful past candidate was, and it was a man. So, let's downgrade the women and hire another man. And that's the kind of thing that's happening everywhere. So, I mean, it's pervasive, the way that the gender inequality exists in digital ecosystems. So the efforts towards gender equality have to be enormous, conscient, and effective in order to counteract this kind of situation. So I'll stop here because I'm pretty sure that many other colleagues will have examples to share as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Marielza. Does anyone else want to add to that?
I could jump in very quickly and say that discrimination, especially against girls and women, because that's what the SDG 5 focuses on, but also non-binary people, is often intersectional. It happens at the intersection of race and gender and class and caste, the color of your skin. Very often, colorism is a huge issue in my country, for example. So there is no one strand of discrimination that these sections of the population face. And I think Marielza has very, very well encapsulated exactly what access as well as safety online mean for these groups. But I think when we remove people when we remove women, girls, and non-binary folks from the internet, or when we fail to provide them a meaningfully safe experience online, we're just compounding those discriminations. And I think we've all heard and seen and read about enough experiences faced by people online, where certain facets of their identity are used against them. So I think big plus one to everything Marielza said. And I think we need to be extremely clear that gender is not just something that we need to think about in silos. I think it's a lens we need to adopt with every single thing we do.
Awesome. I wish there was a way to visually clap. Maybe, I don't know. There's probably some way that I just don't know about. Okay, so I'd like to ask each of you to spend some time with some closing thoughts, maybe a couple minutes each, and we'll go Neethi, Yuwang, Marielza, and Peter can close us out.
Thanks, Joe. So we've all heard enough about the wonders of the internet and what it can facilitate, right? So without going back into it, I think as we build back better, we need to realize the central role that ICTs and the internet play in our lives and how crucial they are really to help achieve the SDGs. So I think I'd like to point out like 4 things that I've been thinking about as I was thinking about this panel and what to say here. Their access, affordability, the quality of the internet we experience, as well as capacity that people have to use ICTs and the internet. And these are all huge questions with no simple, linear answers to any of them. And I'm just going to quickly touch upon each of these. At least I'll try. So we've seen that the internet's not uniformly implemented. About 40% of the world doesn't have access, and even those who do mostly have access through 3G, 4G, and 5G mobile services. There is an urban-rural divide. There is an economic divide, and even if services are available, they're unaffordable, right? So there are remedies. So the first remedy is, of course, talking about just implementation of the physical infrastructure of the internet, is that the physical build out is absolutely necessary. And this could range from anything like direct optical fiber into homes. It could mean 5G mobile implementation. It could mean low Earth orbit satellites. There are a lot of solutions out there. And I think we need to be really innovative about what we can tap and how, and do that affordably. But our efforts can't stop with physical infrastructure. We have to answer questions of affordability, and affordable hardware has now enabled, as Marielza was saying, about just a little less than 800 million people come online during the pandemic. But we must do more to make internet connections more affordable, especially for low income and middle income households. And then finally, the operation of the internet must be robust. It must be safe, secure, reliable. And governments and businesses must not make decisions that impact the open, globally connected, secure, and trustworthy nature of the internet. So, to anyone who's out there listening to, this very fantastic conversation that we've been having for the past hour and few minutes, I ask you to do 3 things. If you see that the internet's fundamental properties are not being understood or being undermined by your government or by a business or by anybody that you know, please act before it's too late, and that when there is no internet to save. So we must absolutely guard against the internet and its open, globally connected nature from being undermined. So if you see something, please say something. Flag threats on social media. Reach out to organizations like ours. Ask your governments to protect the internet. And finally, grow the movement using social media, because every single voice counts. Your voice counts. Back to you, Joe.
Thank you so much. Juwon.
I think, speaking after Neethi, there's very much little I can add because she's so eloquent. I probably want to share, a personal thought. Over the past few years, talking to one group of colleagues, and they are enthusiastic about the opportunity, the benefits of internet, such a beautiful thing, such an important creation, probably the most important creation, and this enthusiasm over the forced industrialization and the tremendous opportunity it creates. So I think we should embrace all of that. But I'm also increasingly worried when you see all these problems that we just described. Peter emphasized the negative impact of shutdown, and Marielza also came out with a list of the challenges. I think this duality of the internet, we really need to pay more attention to it. We need to try to do more to ensure that internet is available to everybody, and that the digital economy, digital government, the benefits produced by the internet are made available to all. And we should continue doing everything we can to ensure that the beautiful, the positive, the great aspects of the internet, we continue expanding on it. But at the same time, we should also address all the problems squarely without flinching away from them. So if we moving ahead keep that duality in mind, I think we will be able to confront the problems, the challenges we face now, while still tapping into the opportunities afforded by the internet. Thank you.
Well said, and so say we all. Marielza.
I think I'll just say yes, Joang. Absolutely. I fully agree with you and with Niti as well. This is, you two are hard act to follow because, you said everything that I wanted to say, but just let me add one thing. Our societies are flawed. Whether we are online or offline, we have discrimination, we have harassment, we have, all these issues that the internet offers, that all the risks that the internet presents. So they are not new to the internet, but the fact that they are amplified and have global reach is new, which means that we have a tremendous responsibility, but here also an incredible source of opportunity that we need to really make sure that is used for good, and as best as we can make it. Human rights-based internet is the dream that we have. An internet that really, is underpinned by the principles of human rights, openness, accessibility, multi-stakeholder engagement, and participation, in which everyone can have a true voice and connect to everyone in a safe and reliable way. And of course, that we all know the risks that exist. So this is why we are so grateful and so happy to be part of a community that has, our colleagues from DESA, our colleagues from ISOC, our colleagues from Access Now, and the people who are watching us today, because, it's together that we'll make this, principles that we want for our societies, for our online lives, to really expand and take hold, and take root. And so thank you very much for having us as part of this conversation, and we'll keep on working with you all to make sure that a human rights-based, humanistic internet is what we will achieve, for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, Peter, after 3 mic drops, it's your turn.
Yeah, I'm not even going to try and compete with those really well-structured remarks. I think I can, just put a few kind of advocacy bids out there. I think, we've built a lot of expertise in the internet governance community, in the, tech and human rights communities. And I think this, session represents, a growing need and interest in reaching out to other sectors, to development experts and worlds, to climate and environmental experts, to gender, UN Women. I think this year, this coming March is going to have its first focus on digital, which is fantastic. And they're opening the door to us, and we need to walk through those doors that are open to us. But I think there's a few more that we need to bust down, and some of those I see coming up are around the COP27 summit, the upcoming climate summit. I think increasingly that's going to involve advocacy and activism, and that's going to have digital components, and ensuring an open information marketplace, and legitimate sources of information, and the free and open exercise of the right to peaceful assembly, both offline in Egypt and online, is going to be key at that event. And we are also pushing for the release of one of our longtime human rights defenders in the digital rights space, Alaa Abdel Fattah, by Egypt in the run-up to that event. We'll also need to reach out to those trade and intellectual property bodies. And I know Wikimedia right now is having trouble getting observer status at WIPO. Kudos to them for putting up that fight. And that's the sort of thing that I look to do with Access Now, and I think our community needs to do, is to again try to open more doors beyond the places we've been talking, because the internet is so, as we've heard, essential to so many different social and cultural and economic systems, and that's not going to change anytime soon. So thank you, and I do hope we can avoid this splintering while also expanding universal access to this wonderful shared resource.
So I want to thank my panelists. It was just absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. As the stroke of midnight in Delhi hits for Neethi over there, I would not want to be working and fighting alongside anybody else on these kinds of issues. And everyone have a wonderful weekend. And the audience, if this intrigues you or you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. As we've emphasized, these are huge problems that are going to take literally massive armies of volunteers and people who care about these issues to fix them over time. So thank you all very much, and have a great weekend.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Very big pleasure. Bye.